Mark, let's start with the recent Munich Security Conference, where Russia's war in Ukraine was, of course, front and center. What stood out to you in terms of what was discussed and what came out of this meeting?
Well, I think there was alarm, particularly in the corridors, less maybe in the public statements, about the state of the war, a feeling that it was at a bit of a pivot point where it was less about the successes till now of Ukraine in containing and reversing Russian advances, and it was more about who had the better supply chain for replenishing their weapons supplies, in a sense that both combatants had real vulnerabilities in those supply chains, that the West was a little too cautious and slow in replenishing the Ukrainians, and that the Russians were desperately searching markets such as Iran and China to see if they could secure more resupply for themselves. So, a war which had been about a slog for territory has become, in this phase, a war about who can secure the best supply chains for rearming.
What do you think year two of this war will reveal to us about Vladimir Putin, what his thinking is, what his intentions are, and essentially what he sees as the end game in Ukraine?
Well, I'm not sure we'll learn much more. I think his stubbornness and the fact he's deep in a bunker of his own making is already pretty clear. But I don't think anybody should underestimate that stubbornness. He's going to, he sees it as strategic patience, and that not for the first time, Russia, as the Soviet Union before it, will see off its opponents by just being willing to fight longer and harder than the other side. And whether it was Napoleon's armies or Hitler's armies, Russian strategic patience and resilience is something people underestimate at their own risk. So I think, he's not going to give in. And the difficulty for Ukraine, a much smaller country, is how they force him to the negotiating table to enter into a peace agreement that will stick. It's quite possible there might be some ceasefire agreement to allow the two sides to rearm, but it needs a much more stable, deeper peace agreement than that, and it's still hard to see the way to that, because Ukraine will want all its territory back. I think there's a question mark about the Crimea, but at the moment Ukraine's claims are that too. And on the Russian side, they're not going to be satisfied without showing that this massive expenditure of Russian human life and economic capacity and the trashing of Russia's international reputation, that there was some reward for that. So you've got two sides with completely conflicting peace ambitions at this point, and that's always hard to try and make a peace when you have that disparity of objectives still. It's a dangerous moment. It's a dangerous moment with a lot of risk on both sides.
Indeed. Mark, the United States has accused Russia of committing war crimes in Ukraine, with U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris saying the perpetrators must be held to account. How does the West do that? I mean, beyond sanctions, how is Vladimir Putin going to be held to account?
Well, I think there is, and we at Open Society Foundations, we are giving financial support to a number of Ukrainian grantees who are documenting war crimes and bringing that documentation to relevant international judicial partners. But it is still quite difficult to see the exact route by which this goes. The International Criminal Court is making investigations. There's been a once-off UN investigatory team. And there is, of course, a call for a special court to look at the crime of aggression, which would be directed particularly at the leadership, in this case, President Putin, and the immediate circle around him. But, I think the key point for everybody to recognize is that, while often the prospects for accountability look bleak at the moment of deep conflict, when you've had this massive number of civilian casualties and the clear targeting of civilians by the Russian side, that, sometimes the prospects for accountability can look at their bleakest at a moment like this. But the contemporary history is more often than not now there is subsequent accountability, often not perfect, but leaders who are behind these kinds of campaigns never walk freely again on the sort of Champs-Élysées or the streets of London or New York. They consign themselves to living in the shadows where international justice is not going to reach them. And, I think we're into that space now for President Putin. Any prospects he might have had of, retiring to the south of France or to a villa he's purportedly built in Switzerland, now lie smashed. In fact, I think his ability to even leave office and ensure that his life would be safe is probably now not possible. So, the wheels of accountability can be slow and the path to justice often quite a complicated one. But I think that Kamala Harris chose to lead off her speech in Munich on this theme shows that Putin really is in the dock on this. He is facing a level of international opprobrium and international justice inquiry that he can never have anticipated when he began this a year ago.
China says it is deeply worried about the long-term impacts of this war. Are there countries in Europe, especially those part of the Western alliance, who are worried as well, who might succumb to war fatigue? I mean, does everyone hold a whatever it takes as long as it takes view?
Well, look, there were plenty of countries at Munich which would share the Chinese concern. The Brazilian foreign minister talked of the need for a peace plan, and other very sensible, respectable countries like Brazil, similarly, are anxious to see this war brought to an end because they have a appropriate diplomatic concern that, just escalation without end is rarely a happy solution in a situation of conflict. But I think within Europe, the lines hold pretty firm. There's, there are obviously thin differences of opinion, but I think, the most striking thing probably in Munich was to see the German Chancellor, Scholz, on the stage at Munich, a year after Germany was still a country which, really always put peace first, declaring and confirming that Germany would now exceed 2% of its GDP spent on military, that it would send those tanks that had been requested to Ukraine and was demanding others follow, and was unequivocal in painting Putin, as a war criminal and an imperialist was the German fashioning of the argument. And so, while you can point at countries which might over time wobble because of the economic consequences of this, I think ultimately people realize that the future of Europe and European security is on the line with this conflict, and they cannot afford to blink.
Mark, we've seen the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov paying multiple visits to the African continent. He's been warmly received in some quarters, and of course the Russians know that they do have sympathizers in significant parts of Africa. What is the unwillingness by much of the global south to back the Western alliance's stance on Ukraine say about geopolitics, and how worried is the West about what it's seeing in parts of the global south?
Well, look, as a very frequent visitor to Africa and somebody who, has roots in the continent and, a huge fascination and passion for it, I have a lot of sympathy for those African countries which are wary of throwing their lot in with the West over Ukraine. First, I don't think there's any doubt that nearly every African country, with the exception of Eritrea, recognizes that this was an illegitimate invasion, and that for Africa, where the sovereignty of borders is an absolutely key principle to stability and peace on the continent, that the behaviors of Russia by this invasion has breached the number one rule as far as Africa is concerned. So that's not really the issue that's in doubt. What's in question is the way that the West has allowed the Ukraine conflict to consume all the diplomatic oxygen, all the economic assistance available, or a huge portion of it, and to not leave enough to address issues in Africa. And there has been a war during this period in Ethiopia, the Tigrayan conflict, which, there are debates about life loss estimates, but it seems probably Ethiopia has so far lost more lives than the Ukraine conflict when you take in, civilian deaths from starvation and public health issues. And, it's been an equally brutal conflict, and it's had very little attention. Now, there is, and this is blamed on double standards. In truth, there are very significant geopolitical strategic differences that I think also explain the difference for tension. But I do understand the frustration of so many in Africa that conflict is largely overlooked, whereas the conflict in Ukraine consumes this huge attention. But beyond that, Africa is in the grip of what's been called the polycrisis, debt crises in countries like Zambia and Ghana, and prospectively many other countries as well. And, issues of fuel price, food prices, the reordering of supply chains in a way that is disrupting economic production in industrial production in many parts of Africa. Given all this, the lack of, real attention and commitment is key. And, they look forward to an issue like climate, which is a problem not of their making, but where the impact is felt heavily in Africa now. And they wonder, where's the Western leadership on that? Where's the carrying through on the pledge of $100 billion a year of climate finance, and let's get that up to the trillions? They see sort of mealy-mouthed efforts to squeeze a bit more out of the World Bank or the African Development Bank, but they don't see the same kind of concerted leadership to address that agenda that they see to address Ukraine. If the West showed that response, some of what they find distasteful, and I would cite, for example, it was impossible in Munich not to hear a lot of complaints about South Africa's military exercises with the Russians. I'm sure it was considered an easy way to pull the West's nose, but it went down like a lead balloon in Munich. But I think the onus is on the West to show it's a good, reliable friend and to discourage South Africa or others reaching out for fair weather friends who don't have the same economic means to provide support and who instead are just into the provision of some very dangerous security support through the Wagner Group and its ilk. So, I think this is a time for the West really to get on top of an Africa strategy, which is one of partnership with Africa, one appropriate for today, not the past, and to put the resource behind it.